Hi, social workers, future social workers. Welcome back to class. We are in, we're in week 9, Social Work 250. And this is kind of a transition week. We're going to be transitioning from learning about history to learning more about policy implementation. So that's what I'm going to be chatting with you about today. And I'm going to start with a quote by Aristotle. He said, "The outcome of a just act is a social world that is more just." Yeah, go Aristotle. Yeah, kind of one of our forerunners for social workers everywhere. And Aristotle was big on justice. And if you've read any of his quotes or ideas, you understand that. A lot of you I know are fascinated by philosophy, and Aristotle was one of our early philosophers, and a lot of writing about social justice. So we're going to talk today on understanding how policy is implemented, and what I would like you to learn today is, first of all, tools and ethical decision making in policy practice. Second, I want you to be able to apply understanding of social, economic, and environmental justice to advocate for human rights at the individual and the system levels. 3, I'd like you to be able to use, to understand the use of appropriate advocacy and negotiation strategies and be able to talk about those and understand them. I want you to understand the use of empathy, of self-regulation, interpersonal skills to effectively engage diverse clients and constituencies. Number 5, I hope you'll be able to understand perspective taking and effective use of self in policy practice. Number 6, I want you to be able to negotiate, mediate, and advocate with and on behalf of diverse clients and constituents. And last but not least, recognize that vulnerable groups may be unable to voice their needs or advocate for themselves and address the role of popular beliefs and stigma in social policy. So kind of a heavy load for 1 week, but we'll take it a little at a time. So implementation appraisal is what I'd like to start with. This is a detailed description of public programs that are the products of social policy. There are 5 key aspects of a program. First is the goal or the social problem that it addresses. So let's take domestic violence, and because that's something I'm fairly familiar with because I owned a business teaching domestic violence classes. My agency, or program, whatever you want to call it, it's what would have been the social problem, domestic violence, right? So what was the goal? This is what I found really interesting. Do you know in Carson City that there is an organization that is basically the statewide organization for the prevention of domestic violence? Guess what their goal is? That there will be 0 victims of domestic violence. And, initially you might think, wow, how could they even hope to achieve that goal? Well, one act of domestic violence, if you're the person that's being acted upon, that's one act too many, right? And so I love that goal. It's a lot of people might think it's unrealistic, but that's the goal, 0 domestic violence. So the basis of entitlement or eligibility, who is eligible for the services? For me, it was anybody who was willing to come to the class. They didn't even have to pay necessarily. I did a lot of pro bono work in that agency. But I did have a price for my classes, and I had everybody from a lawyer to a homeless guy in my class. And so I had a sliding fee scale for my class. Eligibility, you did not have to be court ordered to take my class. I had clients who were therapist ordered and wife ordered. Yeah, wife ordered clients. There's such a thing. So there we go. That was number 2, the basis for entitlement or eligibility. Number 3, the nature of the benefit or service provided. So I provided a 26-week course on domestic violence, and it kind of mirrored, it was a curriculum that was developed, a professional out of Reno developed the curriculum that I used, but I really liked it. And you have to believe in change to be a social worker. And I can definitely say that I saw change in the people that came through my agency. There's a big difference between the guy who was taking a class for the first, second, or third time and the guy that had been there 24 weeks. So they helped each other, and that was really an interesting part of it. So the benefit was basically change, changing their attitude, changing their behavior. The administrative structure used to deliver the program was basically I had to answer to the statutes. I had to answer to the Domestic Violence Committee in Carson City. I had to write a 2-inch thick proposal to be able to even teach the class in the first place, and send all of my basically it was seriously about a 2-inch thick book that I put together in all of the reasons that that I was qualified to teach these classes, including peer-reviewed journal articles, and showing that well, basically reaffirming what the society, what the people in Carson City said would change people, and that is that group therapy is the most beneficial, and that is how you're more likely to change someone with a domestic violence issue. And so the administrative structure was I had to answer to them. I did have a couple of employees who had to answer to me, and then I had the people who were eligible for the program who came in and took part in it. So it was probably one of the most simple agencies that you can have. And, you know, I had to have a license from the city and from the state, and so I had to pay those fees. And the program's financial mechanism was basically I charged for the class, and I paid my rent for my space out of what was paid to me. I paid my employee, and yeah, there you go. So let's talk a little bit about Prince policy appraisal, and what is that? So Niccolo, and I have a hard time saying this name, Machiavelli, he wrote his proposal treatise, The Prince, during the 16th century. You might have already learned about this in your economics classes, but let's go over it a little bit. He focused on the effective use of political power. Aptly named for his work, the technique of Prince policy appraisal can be used to gauge the power dynamics that determine political support for a new policy initiative, offering a systematic approach to understanding policy processes that might otherwise seem mysterious. And so there's 5 steps in this technique. First of all, identify the players who are likely to affect the decision. Second, determine a position for each player. Third, estimate the power that each player brings to the issue. Fourth, estimate the priority of the issue for each player. And fifth, calculate the likelihood that the policy will be implemented. So analysis begins with specification of the program goal and the problem it addresses. When we turn to the best scientific evidence available to describe the affected population and the cause of the problem. So let's use an example. If we were to, well, let's stick with domestic violence, since that's one that probably most of you are familiar with to some extent. So the specification of a program goal and the problem it addresses. So luckily, we have a legal system that specifies what domestic violence is. And one of the things that we recognize as social workers is that if someone feels like they have been abused, that's where we take the definition. The definition comes from the victim. If someone feels like they've been victimized, then they have. Now, what's interesting is we have a legal and a social system that wants to identify that. A lot of the times as a social worker, you will have to ask if there is physical evidence of abuse, and that seems to be in child protective services what is most recognized is physical abuse. And so a lot of the times you're not going to see the signs for psychological abuse or sexual abuse. Neglect is a little bit easier to see, and it's important to remember that it is the most prevalent of all abuse is neglect. So anyway, let's get back to what the public values and beliefs are about the problem and its relationship to other social problems that can affect attitudes toward the program. One of the things that I saw in rural Nevada, working with domestic violent perpetrators, was that there was kind of a public value among a lot of these individuals, particularly the men, that there wasn't anything wrong with hitting somebody. And for example, I had one young man say to me, it's fine to hit your kids. I mean, my parents used to hit me with a spoon. They used a wooden spoon, and look at me, I turned out fine. And I'm thinking, you're in a court-ordered domestic violence class. You didn't really turn out that great, buddy. Let's take a look at this. It was interesting. He went home. He lived in another state. He went home to the other state and told his parents about me, and they were just livid that I would say that he had been physically abused, because that's what I said to him. I said, buddy, you were physically abused as a kid. I think that's really important too when you're working with these individuals, that you validate the underlying reason for their behavior. And he was hit as a kid. Of course I mean, not of course. A lot of people, you don't have to repeat the abuse that happened to you, but he did. So he's in a court-ordered class. So that value or belief system for his culture, his subculture of his family, had an influence on him. And I noticed that in rural Nevada, there seems to be kind of a negative attitude toward women. And so, that kind of tends to be translated in the form of domestic violence, which is sad but true. So drug use, that definitely played into the problem. If for those of you who know someone who work in the mines, or maybe you've worked in the mines, it seems that there's a culture of drinking among those who work in the mines. 99% of the individuals I worked with who were convicted with a domestic violence conviction had been drinking or using some kind of drug. It was very, very rare that someone came in who was sober when they committed their domestic violence. So this definitely is something that plays into the problem. So these are some things you have to look at in setting your goals, recognizing what the social problems are surrounding the problem that you're working with. What is the basis for entitlement? Knowledge of eligibility criteria is central to understanding a program's intent and operations. Eligibility might be based on membership in a group assumed to be needy, including blind, deaf, physically handicapped, elderly, people with AIDS, children in a certain age rate. People are considered at-risk teenagers. It might be based on a carefully assessed need, such as a disability or poverty, or it may be limited to those who work or those who don't work. And what I think is really interesting, so if you look at my agency that I owned and ran, the basis for eligibility, like I said, was someone who was having anger management problems. They didn't have to have been convicted of a domestic violence conviction. Now, most of them had, but they didn't have to. I did have some people. I actually was in Walmart one day, and a mom was yelling at her little kid, and I handed her my business card, and I said, hey, if you ever want to come in and talk to somebody, here you go. And I thought she was going to get really upset. She called me a couple hours later, and she's like, thank you so much. I have a real problem with rage. And I'm like, oh, wow, come on in, And one of the things that I loved about that business is that it ended up being a really warm, wonderful place for the people who took advantage of it. And so It's important to distinguish between eligibility and access. People who are eligible for a program do not necessarily receive benefits. Barriers to access, both formal and informal, can make eligibility little more than a joke. So, for example, I had it didn't seem like it was a fair distribution of Latino men that were convicted with a domestic violence conviction who were sent to my program. And as I really interviewed them and got to know them, I kind of got the idea that many of them were targeted, and that there's definitely some racism going on in that program. And so, or among the professionals who were convicting these guys of domestic violence. And so one of the things that I did was create this sliding scale, and some of these people who had a hard time paying for the class. So that could be a barrier, having a hard time paying for the class, or feeling like they had to pay, that was part of their punishment. And of course, I had some that wanted to take advantage of that in a negative way, and I had to figure out the difference, and that can be challenging. Also, if one of the other barriers was language, I had to have a relative of one of my clients come in and translate, because I don't speak very much Spanish. My male counterpart spoke enough, but not enough to really teach the class. And so we had this gentleman's relative come in to translate for him. And that can be, if you don't speak the language, those of you who have another language besides English, you're going to be great social workers, and you're so needed. But that can be a huge barrier. Lack of outreach to inform people about the program's existence. I didn't have a very good presence on the internet, and I would, take my business cards around to the different courts and things like that. But it wasn't until I got a Facebook page that people could find me a little more readily. And I haven't owned that business for like 3 years, and I still get phone calls, and I'm able to pay them to pass that along to the people who do it now. But sometimes the location can be a challenge. And one of the things that we're seeing in rural Nevada is, of course, online programs popping up. I'm not sure that they're as effective, but we're working on them being effective. This current coronavirus thing is helping us recognize the need for online services. So, complex and stigmatizing eligibility procedure. Yeah, anytime that someone feels a sense of stigma, are they going to reach out for resources? No. I worked with one mom who had a real problem with domestic violence, and probably wasn't abusing her children, but felt like she could be a better mother, but was scared to call and look into parenting classes, because she was afraid that if she admitted that she had an anger management issue, that she'd be stigmatized, and that Child Protective Services would land on her doorstep and take her kids away from her. So also paltry benefits. If the benefits aren't worth what, if they aren't what the client really needs, then what good is that going to do? So the nature of the benefit. Public programs offer 4 types of benefits: services, goods, vouchers, and cash. So services, obviously a lot of you will be involved with that. And benefits vary in the degree of choice or power afforded to the recipient. Services and goods provide the least choice. It's very important to know. Social workers like to believe that our professional services empower the needy, but how many of the needy would choose to receive them? How many of the needy would choose to go to a parenting class? Maybe they feel like they can learn everything that they need to know just by watching grandma, or by reading a book, or online, or whatever. So the way we deliver services can disempower recipients. Since we usually make ourselves available from 9 to 5, how is that going to work for someone who's working full time? Yeah, that's not going to work. So sometimes we might need to have later hours or earlier hours. Goods offer a little more choice because clients can usually take it or leave it. Distribution of food commodities is characteristic. So in one community, low-income adults stand in line at 6 in the morning waiting for the cheese truck to arrive in the community center. And large slabs of cheese are handed out along with a dose of humiliation. So is that going to be something that people are going to be willing to accept if you're humiliated? I love what I see happening in Las Vegas in the current coronavirus culture, where people are really reaching out, and that stigma of getting lunch for your kids has really been lifted in this time of need, and that's really cool to see. I've talked about Frank McCourt and his book Angela's Ashes a lot. I love it. We actually have a student in the program who's a close relative of Frank McCourt. He talks about watching his mom receive handouts from the Catholic Board of Charities and then feeling humiliated. If you've seen that movie, you remember that scene. And how he feels humiliation for his mother. They did a really good job in that movie of depicting the scene that was in the book. But the book explains it even a whole lot more about just how hard it was to watch his mom be degraded. And not just his mom, but all the women that were living in poverty that had no choice but to go to this organization, which was definitely part of that Elizabethan poor law, or a definitely an evolution of what those attitudes were, right? So Frank sensed his mother's deep humiliation. And maybe that's part of the reason that we no longer have actual food stamps in the food stamp program. We now have a debit card. So it has less of the appearance of poverty, right? It looks more like a typical bank card. And so only the people who are the recipients of it know that it's being used. Actually, I'm not sure that's true. I think sometimes the cashier knows as well. But there definitely should be some confidentiality when someone's hired to be a grocery store clerk. Yeah, probably some of you know more about that than I do. Vouchers limit choice to a range of products. So recipients can usually select when and where they receive the goods. SNAP is an example of that. The products that are purchased are restricted, but shoppers can choose the store and shop at their convenience using an EBT card. So cash provides the greatest choice and flexibility to the recipient. It can be used anywhere, anytime, and it can purchase anything. As a result, programs that deliver cash are subject to criticism. Why? Because what are you going to spend that cash on? You're going to use drugs? What's going to happen with it? Recipients are incapable of making rational decisions about money management is often the attitude. And I think we do need to be careful about that in this day and age, and recognize that we got to make sure we got to make sure the people that are the most vulnerable are cared for. Okay, administrative structure. There are 4 aspects of a public program in terms of the administrative structure. There's centralization, staff characteristics, citizen participation, and appeal procedures. I'm going to let you guys read that part on your own in our lecture outline today. And yeah, I think I've talked a lot. How about you? I want to kind of close with the social justice framework for policy analysis. We have the most technical, sophisticated cost-benefit analysis is informed by a basic understanding of what is just or beneficial. And so in this way, social justice pervades policy analysis as one of the following: a philosophy, a mission, and a goal. So let's talk about those 3 areas. First of all, a philosophy. What is the philosophy of social justice? Well, basically that people are treated equal. And I don't know, that we as social workers have the same attitude toward the janitor at Great Basin College as we would to President Helen's, right? What's the mission? To really make change happen, right? And so what would be a goal within those within the philosophy and the mission? A goal would be something specific that we want to change. A lot of you are dedicated to child protective services, and I love that. I think that's brilliant and wonderful. I couldn't. I worked with a lot of foster kids that had been taken from their families and that were working with child protective services. So I've been on the boards and been on the wraparound committees to help these families. It's very, very difficult work, but it's so needed. So the philosophy of child protective services is basically children should be able to grow up in a safe family, right? In a safe home environment. The mission is to help that happen. So what would be a goal specifically in that would be for this child to have a safe foster home, or be able to have the parents trained in such a way so that they can return to a safe home. And I love the way that is, that the attitudes toward that is starting to change. I spoke with someone a couple of years ago who's a social worker in Michigan, and she was telling me that they have a program back there in which instead of taking children out of their home, the parents are taken out of their home. And then the foster parents are brought in to the child's or the children's home, and they basically raise the children for the allotted time, and then the parents are gradually brought back into the home, and the foster parents model appropriate parenting for these families. And I just think that's brilliant. I mean, a kid admits that somebody is abusing them, and then they're taken out of their home. That there's just something wrong with that innately. And so to be able to allow the child to stay in their home and bring someone in who's a competent parent and then train their own parents, I think that's a brilliant approach. I would love to see that happen in Nevada. All right, guys, that is all I have for this week. And keep reading, keep studying. I know it's hard. We're in the home stretch, though, only a few weeks left. And don't hesitate to call, text, or email me if you have any questions.